People ask me now how I could have said it. In front of everyone, in front of him, with a smile. And I never know how to explain that it felt, in the moment, like the truest thing I had said in years. I told my husband that if he was so jealous, the door was open. I said it because Sasha was there, and I had an audience, and because somewhere in the gap between what I believed about my marriage and what I was doing to it, I had convinced myself that the problem was his reaction, not mine. What I did not understand, what I could not see from inside the performance of that evening, was that the door I pointed him toward was the only one I had ever genuinely needed him to stay on the right side of. My name is Mara Voss, and I am 33 years old, and for most of those years I have been very good at making rooms feel comfortable. That is essentially my job. I coordinate events for a living, which means I spend my days deciding where the flowers go and how the lighting should sit and what order things should happen in, so that the people inside the room feel, without knowing why, that everything is exactly right. I am good at this. People hire me because I make the difficult parts invisible and the beautiful parts obvious, and for a long time I thought this was simply a professional skill, something I had developed through training and repetition. It took me longer than it should have to understand that I had been doing it my entire life, long before anyone paid me for it, starting in my mother's house when I was 8 years old and learning to arrange myself into the shape that caused the least friction with the people I needed most. Cole and I have been married for 4 years, and together for 3 before that. He is a corporate attorney, precise and fair in the way that his profession requires. And when we met, I loved the sharpness of him, the way he could take a complicated thing apart and put it back together in a shape that made more sense. We used to argue about books and politics and everything else, and I changed my mind about things because of him. And this felt, at the time, like the best kind of conversation to be inside. The reading corner of our living room has 2 copies of the same novel on the shelf. The old one with my university underlinings in pencil, the new one Cole bought when the spine of the first copy broke, with a note in his handwriting on the inside cover. Both of them sit there together. Some mornings I run my finger across both spines without stopping to take either one down, and I have never asked myself why I keep doing this. Sasha has been my best friend since the first week of university. She is an illustrator, warm and irreverent, and she has a way of listening that leaves things unfinished on purpose, which I had not understood was rare until recently. Lately, I have been going to her studio more often than I used to. Lately, I have been texting her things I don't bring to the dinner table. Cole noticed I was staying up later. He came to the reading corner one evening and asked, gently, whether everything was all right between us, and he said he had noticed the lamp staying on past midnight 3 nights in a row, which is something he tracks without meaning to, because he is a person who notices patterns in things he cares about. I told him work had been heavy, and I was fine. He said okay. He believed me because I am very good at being believed. I should have known then that the thing growing quietly in the corner of my life was not as small as I was telling myself it was. The first time I went to Sasha's studio with something more than a visit in mind, I told Cole I had a client meeting that ran long. The studio was on the other side of the suburb, small, organised in the way of a person who makes things for a living, canvases stacked along one wall and a good chair that she always gave to me. I sat in it and talked about the venue contract I had been managing, about the suburb, about the morning walks I had been taking since we moved, and Sasha listened the way she always has, without redirecting, without arriving somewhere before I finished getting there. She asked questions that went sideways instead of forward. Not where is this going, but what does that feel like? Not what are you going to do, but what did you want to do before you decided? I drove home afterward with my hands on the wheel and a feeling in my chest I could not locate precisely. Something warm and wide that I had not produced in a long time. The lie had been easy. This was the thing I could not stop returning to on the drive. Not guilt exactly, but something more clinical. A kind of assessment. I had said a different place and a different reason, and it had come out of my mouth with the smooth ease of something practiced, and I had not practiced it. I went upstairs when I got home and washed my face and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment before going back down to where Cole was in the study. And what I saw in the mirror was not a person who looked troubled. That was the thing. He was at the kitchen table when I came through, and he was calm in the way he is always calm, which is a particular kind of calm that I have begun to understand is not the same as ease. He said that I came home smelling like Sasha's apartment, the specific cedar and turpentine smell of her studio that clings differently than anything at Danny's house. And that he was not saying this to start an argument, but because he noticed, and he did not want to pretend he hadn't. He asked where I had actually been. He asked it once and waited, which is something he does. He builds the space for an answer and leaves it open rather than filling it himself. I told him I had gone to see Sasha because I needed to, and that needing to see my best friend without it becoming an examination was apparently too much to ask. He said he knew Sasha was allowed to be something I had. He said it without raising his voice. Then he said that what he was asking was simpler than I was making it. He wanted to know if he could trust what I told him about where I was, because trust was not abstract for him. It was practical. It was the thing the house ran on. And if it was slipping, he needed to know now rather than later. I told him he was cataloguing my movements and calling it concern, which proved my point about the marriage better than anything I could have said directly. He went to the kitchen. He did not push further. I stood in the hallway and assembled the case. A man whose first instinct is to find the inconsistency is a man who trusts the investigation more than the person being investigated. I had this argument ready. I had been building it for months without knowing I was building it, adding items to it the way you add things to a shelf until the shelf is full and you stop noticing you're doing it. The voice note I sent Sasha from Cole's tablet that week was a mistake I did not realize I was making. My phone was charging across the room, and the messaging app was open on his screen, and I picked it up without thinking, and I sent a note that was long and specific and private. I described what I had been feeling, what I wanted, and in the middle of it I said something about Cole that I said in the easy way you say things to your closest friend. Without the editing, I would have applied if I had known it was going to matter. I called the marriage fair in the way courts are fair, which sounds like a compliment if you say it quickly, and is not one at all. I put the tablet down on the coffee table and went to make tea. Cole's phone received the note at 11 that night. I was already asleep. He did not mention it for 4 days. He listened to it with his earphones in at his nightstand, and I did not know this until later, and in those 4 days he behaved exactly as he always had. He made coffee, he asked about my work, he came to bed at a reasonable hour. He held my hand briefly on a Wednesday evening when we were watching something on television, and the hand-holding felt like the most ordinary thing in the world. I look back at those 4 days now and understand them differently than I did at the time. At the time, I thought nothing had shifted. At the time, I was already planning what I would wear to Danny and Rob's garden party the following Saturday. The photo that came through from a neighborhood dinner I hadn't attended was the thing I kept returning to in the days before the party. It was a candid shot, Cole at a table, mid-sentence, and the laugh on his face was the one I had fallen in love with at the beginning. Ungoverned, full, not managed at all. He was leaning slightly forward the way he only does when something has genuinely caught him, and there was a glass of wine near his right hand, and the lamp behind him made his face look softer than he usually allows it to look in company. I was not in the photo. I sent it to Sasha with no caption, and she replied asking where I had been, and I put the phone down without answering because the question, the garden party, was at Danny and Rob's house, on a warm Saturday with string lights stretched across the back section and a low stone wall along the hydrangeas that Sasha and I found within 20 minutes of arriving. It happened the way things happen when they have been building for a while, naturally, easily, with the ease of something that was already decided. We sat on that wall and the conversation narrowed in the way it does when two people stop being aware of the other people around them. and I knew somewhere in the back of my awareness that we were visible from the garden, that the position we occupied had a quality that anyone looking would read correctly. Sasha had the copy of the novel in her canvas bag, the one she had borrowed from me years ago and never returned, still with my old bookmarks between the pages. When I saw it, something passed between us that I don't have a clean word for. Recognition, maybe, or the particular shorthand of people who have read the same things and know what the other one underlined. The exchange lasted 3 seconds. Cole, from across the lawn where he had been standing in conversation with Rob, saw it happen. He could not have known what book it was. He knew what the exchange looked like, which is a different and more precise kind of knowledge. Rob went inside to get wine he had not been planning to get. Danny, from across the garden, looked at something in her hands and did not look back up. Vera Hatch, who is 61 years old and has known Cole since his law school years, sat at the garden table at the far end and did not move and did not look away. Cole came across the lawn at about 9:15, and I saw him coming from the corner of my vision before he arrived. He walked at his normal pace, which is always deliberate, and when he reached the low wall he said, quietly, that we should think about heading home soon. That was all he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Sasha with anything other than his normal expression. He said it as a suggestion, in the tone of a man who is trying to give the moment somewhere to go. I said, in front of 8 people who had stopped discussing other things, that if he was feeling jealous, the door was open. I said it with a smile. The smile was entirely real. I felt, in that moment, like a person who had finally stopped being arranged, like someone who had spoken a sentence that was entirely hers and had not been improved before it left her mouth. Sasha laughed softly. Someone at the garden table shifted in their chair. Cole said he would be at the car when I was ready. He said it once to me alone, close enough that only I heard the specific quality of the calm in his voice, which was not the calm of a man who had accepted the situation, but the calm of a man who had made a decision about it. He went to find Danny and Rob and thanked them specifically for the evening in the way he always does. Not effusively, but correctly, with the courtesy of someone who was raised to leave rooms properly. He walked through the garden gate. The gate closed. I turned back to Sasha and made a joke I had already prepared, and it landed, and the garden resumed its conversation at a slightly different register than before. I got home at 11. Cole's car was in the driveway. The house was lit from inside. I stood on the path for a moment before I went in, not because I was afraid, but because there was something in the lit windows that was asking me a question I wasn't ready for. Cole was in the reading chair with a book. He said hello when I came through the door, and he said he was heading to bed soon, and he went upstairs without asking about the evening. He didn't take the book with him. He left it open, face down, on the armrest of the chair, which is something he never does because he is careful with books. I noticed it and said nothing. He was already in bed or performing sleep when I came up. His phone was face down on the nightstand. I lay in the dark and thought about the garden gate closing behind him and the specific expression on Vera Hatch's face before I looked away from her. And I told myself that his composure proved what I had been saying, that a man who trusts his own position will respond to it, and a man whose position is performance will exit when the performance is inconvenient. Vera called him the following morning. She told me this herself a week later when she called me directly. She said she had known Cole for 18 years and she was not calling him to take sides, and she was calling me because she thought I was someone she respected, and she thought I was in the middle of something I could not fully see. She said she was available if I wanted to talk. I said I appreciated that. I said it without warmth and hung up and sat in the reading corner for 20 minutes without turning the lamp on, both copies of the novel on the shelf above my head. My mother arrived without calling first on a Sunday, which is how I knew she had already decided the visit was necessary before she could talk herself out of it. Patricia has always been this way, organised, efficient, arriving with a reason that is adjacent to the real reason. She said she was in the area. We sat in her sitting room with tea and I told her carefully that things had been complicated lately. I described Cole's method, the arguments that built toward positions he had already identified, the conversations that landed somewhere he had charted before they started. I described the suburb decision, the spreadsheet, the 3 months, the moment I had agreed without being entirely sure how I had arrived at the agreement, the way the conversation had a beginning and a middle and a conclusion he had already written, and all I had to do was walk the distance between them. She listened to all of it. Then she said it sounded like her. She said that was what she used to do with me. She would listen, and then she would fix it, and she had always believed that was the same thing as helping. She said she was not defending Cole. She was asking whether I had told him what fixing felt like from my side, or whether I had managed around telling him the way I had learned to manage around telling her. She said it without accusation, in the tone of a woman who has earned the right to say a difficult thing by having lived long enough to see it clearly. I said I had tried. She said, had I arranged the conversation into something easier before it reached him? The way I used to arrange myself at the dinner table when I was 9 years old, and she was moving too fast for me to keep up with. The sitting room was quiet. A car passed outside. I said I had to go. I drove home without making the counter-argument I had ready, which was not because the counter-argument was unavailable, but because it had a gap in it I could see clearly and could not close. Cole was in the living room when I got home, in the reading chair, with the lamp on and nothing in his hands. He was not on his phone, and he was not reading, and he was not looking at anything purposeful. He was simply in the room with something he had not resolved, his hands face up in his lap in the way I had seen once before, at his father's funeral 5 years ago, when he was not trying to manage what was on his face. I stood in the doorway. I counted 8 seconds. I decided, standing there, that this was a performance of sadness, that a man who argues by being right will deploy stillness when the argument is going against him, because stillness is harder to answer than logic. I went to make tea. When I came back, he had the book open and we talked about what to have for dinner, and I did not ask what he had been thinking about. The book he had open was not one he had been reading before. He had picked up the nearest thing, which happened to be the old copy of the novel with my underlinings in it, and he had it open to a page in the middle, and I do not believe he had read a word of it. The posts I wrote came 3 days after the garden party, and I wrote them carefully, in the reading corner, before Cole was up. I described the marriage without naming him, thoughts that were systematically improved until they belonged to someone else, the specific texture of conceding without knowing how you arrived at the concession. I wrote it with the fluency of a person who has been building an argument for months, and when I published the 2 posts, they performed the way I had suspected they would. Women who recognized the pattern, comments from people who had been there, the specific warmth of being witnessed by strangers. I read the comments for 2 days and felt, genuinely, seen. The feeling had a half-life I did not account for, but in those 2 days, it was real. A former colleague of Cole's sent the posts to him. He read them at his office with the door closed. That evening, he came home and went directly to the study without stopping in the kitchen, and I heard him on the phone. Brief, 6 minutes, the voice he uses with professionals. I went to the doorway and saw on the yellow notepad on his desk the name Ashton and Beale with a phone number beneath it. I did not recognize the name. I told myself it was a professional referral, a case contact, something unrelated to me. I told myself this with a focused effort, and then went to cook dinner. The following morning, the filing cabinet in his study, which had always been partially open and casually disordered, was organized, labeled dividers visible through the drawer, a folder on the desk marked personal that had not been there before. Inside it, when I looked quickly while he was in the kitchen, were the joint account records going back 3 years and the home insurance documents, all arranged with a cleanliness that was not his usual method. He had moved them deliberately, with the same precision he brings to the cases he builds. And the precision here was not professional. It was personal. And the difference was audible to me even in the silence of the study. I found the boiler warranty I had used as a reason to be in the room in the kitchen drawer where it had always been. I put it back. I closed the study cabinet. I told myself he had started an admin project he mentioned once. I went to Sasha's studio that Wednesday with the 2 posts printed out, and this was the deliberate act: printing them, carrying them across the suburb in my bag, placing them on the work table in front of her so that what I had said publicly became something a witness had held in her hands. I wanted the words to exist somewhere outside a screen, to have weight and edges, to be a thing I had committed to rather than something that could be deleted with a gesture. I told her I was going to tell Cole that evening. I told her it was decided. Sasha read through both posts slowly, and when she finished, she asked whether I was ready for his response, not whether the posts were accurate, whether I was ready for what came after them. I said I was. What I noticed, and did not examine, was that she had said his response and not that she would be there for it, and these were different shapes of the same sentence. I drove home through the suburb at dusk with the particular quality of light that makes familiar streets look like a version of themselves, and I sat in the car in the driveway for a moment before going in, the way I have been doing more often lately, gathering something before I enter a room. Cole was on the sofa, not in the chair. The sofa, which was unusual, the choice of a man who wanted to be less defended. He said my name. He said he had been reading and rereading the posts for 2 days and that he was not going to argue about them in the way I expected. He said the phrase that he could not get past was the one about thoughts being improved until they belonged to someone else, and he wanted to know, not whether the marriage had problems, he already knew the marriage had problems, but whether he had ever refused to hear me. He asked specifically whether he had ever walked away from a conversation I needed to have, or told me to stop, or made it impossible for me to speak. He said he was asking because he needed to understand the difference between what he had done and what I had written, and if he could not find that difference, he needed me to show it to him. He said this while looking at me in the direct way he has when he is not constructing anything. Just looking, just asking, just a person across a room who wants an honest answer. He offered 1 month where he would stop building toward conclusions. He said he did not know how to do it, and that he was telling me this because admitting he did not know how to do something was difficult for him. And he was doing it anyway because the marriage was worth the difficulty. He said, 1 month, and we speak without me driving toward anything. And we find out what the marriage sounds like when I stop doing the thing that has cost you. I said I appreciated that he was offering to try now. I said it had taken the posts becoming visible for this conversation to happen, and that the absence of this conversation for 6 years was not a minor thing I could treat as a starting point rather than a record. I said he had argued me into a suburb I had not chosen, into positions I had not originated, and had called this a marriage, and that what he was offering now was to stop being himself in response to the evidence of what being himself had cost me. I said it with absolute clarity, and I meant every word, and the argument was largely true, and I delivered it the way I deliver the difficult parts of an event, cleanly, with all the difficult bits made invisible. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said he had never stopped me from speaking. He said it once without any heat in it, in the tone of a man stating something he believed to be precisely correct. He said he had argued with me, and that arguing with someone was a different thing from silencing them, and that he needed me to understand the difference. He stood up and said he had some things to organize in the morning, and that he would handle what came next carefully. He went to the spare room. He closed the door with a quietness that was more deliberate than noise, the specific quietness of a person who has decided that the conversation is over and is choosing not to announce it. I stood in the living room with both copies of the novel on the shelf above me and opened my mouth to finish the sentence that would answer what he had said. There was no sentence. I had been treating arguing and silencing as the same category for 2 years, and he was right that they were not. And the case I had built, The posts I had written, the printed pages I had laid on Sasha's table, the sentence I had said at the garden party in front of 8 people, was constructed on the distance between those two things, and I had closed that distance myself. I held this for perhaps 30 seconds before I went to the kitchen, but I had held it, and it had been there, and it had the specific quality of something that would not go back to being invisible just because I had stopped looking at it. In the morning his car was gone before 7, and the spare room door was open, and the room was empty, and the notepad that had always been on his nightstand was not there. He texted midweek and asked if I was free for dinner Thursday. He named the restaurant, the Garden Room at Ashton Place, which is where we had our first date 7 years ago. I did not know whether the choice was deliberate or whether he had simply run out of neutral options, and I went because 7 years of marriage means you go, even when you are not sure what you are walking into. I arrived first. The booth was not the one from the first date, but the light was the same quality, warm, low, specific to that room in a way I had not thought about in years. Cole arrived at 7 exactly and sat down without opening the menu and put 2 documents on the table between us. He said he had considered other venues and chosen this one because he wanted me to have all available information, not only what was on the pages. The first document was a civil complaint for false light defamation, with a 72-hour deadline to take down both posts. The complaint referenced the voice note I had sent from his tablet, the one that arrived on his phone at 11 that night, the one I had forgotten existed, because the note contained my own description of the marriage as running out of room and fare in the way courts are fair, which directly contradicted the public account of a controlled and suppressive relationship. The second document was a divorce petition, filed the previous Monday, with temporary orders attached and a first hearing 31 days from filing. I looked at both documents. I looked at the restaurant, the specific restaurant, the light, the booth that was almost the one from the beginning. I looked at him across the table. He said he was sorry it had come to this, and he meant it in the particular way he means things, which is completely. He said he would be at a hotel until the hearing, and that they could communicate through attorneys, but that if I needed to reach him directly, he would not make that difficult. He left before the food arrived. I sat at the table alone and thought about what I had believed the sentence at the garden party was, "The door is open," and how it had felt, in the moment of saying it, like the truest thing I had expressed in years. The internal contradiction is not that I was wrong about everything. The internal contradiction is that the door I pointed him toward was the only one I had ever genuinely needed him to stay inside, and the freedom I found in saying it lasted exactly as long as it took for him to actually use it. Closure snapshot. I took the posts down within 48 hours inside the deadline and said nothing publicly about the takedown. The women who had commented sent direct messages asking what had happened, and I read every one and replied to none of them, because the specific warmth of being witnessed by strangers turns out to have a cost that only becomes visible after the witnessing is finished. I moved into Kirsten's spare room, a friend from work 3 miles from the house, someone outside the garden party's orbit, and the room had one window facing a fence and a narrow bed, and the particular borrowed quality of a space that knows you are only passing through it. I went to Sasha's studio 3 weeks later with the expectation of something I had not quite named, and she made tea and was warm and told me she needed time to understand what she wanted outside the shape the last few months had given things, and I finished the tea and left and did not go back, because a person who is available in the margins of someone else's life is available in the margins, and the margin had closed. The work continued. A venue referral came through. I did good work, the professional self held in the way it always holds. The difficult parts made invisible, and the beautiful parts made obvious, exactly as trained. I took the old copy of the novel when I packed, the one with my university underlinings, and left the one with his note on the shelf where both of them had always been. I walk the suburb streets every morning on a different route now, learning where they go in the quiet that is entirely mine and costs exactly what I agreed to pay for it, And some mornings I run my finger along the spines of books on Kirsten's shelf without stopping, without taking any of them down. And I know now why I have always done this, and knowing has not made me stop.